Long before modern laboratories, satellites, and digital equations, humanity already possessed a form of science that today feels unsettlingly advanced. Not advanced in the way of microchips or engines, but in its understanding of matter, energy, vibration, geometry, and nature itself. This science did not separate the physical from the spiritual, the mechanical from the cosmic. It treated the universe as a single, living system governed by laws that could be observed, measured, and used. Over thousands of years, this knowledge was refined, guarded, and passed down, not through textbooks, but through monuments, myths, symbols, and machines that still resist complete explanation. What we call ancient history may actually be the ruins of a forgotten scientific age. Across continents that had no known contact, ancient civilizations developed technologies and principles that appear eerily synchronized. Massive stone structures aligned with celestial events down to fractions of a degree. Materials that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Medical practices that understood anatomy, psychology, and surgery far beyond what was supposed to exist at the time. Mathematical constants embedded into architecture long before they were formally defined. These were not accidents, nor were they products of primitive trial and error. They were the results of systems of knowledge that have largely vanished from our records. Modern science is built on reductionism. It breaks reality into smaller and smaller parts to understand how they function. Ancient science worked in the opposite direction. It began with the whole and moved inward. To the ancients, the human body mirrored the cosmos. The flow of stars reflected the flow of blood. The vibration of sound shaped matter. Geometry was not an abstract concept, but a force capable of organizing reality itself. This worldview allowed them to develop technologies that seem impossible when viewed through a modern lens. Consider the precision of ancient stonework. In places like Egypt, Peru, and India, stones weighing tens or even hundreds of tons were cut, shaped, transported, and fitted together with tolerances so tight that modern blades cannot slide between them. These stones were not merely stacked. They were interlocked, sometimes in ways that allowed them to absorb seismic energy, making structures earthquake-resistant thousands of years before seismology existed. The common explanation claims brute force and simple tools, yet no tool marks consistent with such methods are found. Something else was at work. There is growing evidence that ancient builders understood the properties of stone at a vibrational level. Sound, resonance, and frequency may have been used to manipulate materials in ways we no longer comprehend. Legends from Tibet to Egypt speak of stones lifted by sound. While modern science dismisses these accounts as myth, experiments in cymatics show that sound frequencies can organize matter into complex geometric patterns. If sound can shape sand and water, it raises an uncomfortable question. What else can it shape under the right conditions? Ancient texts repeatedly describe the universe as vibration. In India, the concept of Nada Brahma declares that the world is sound. In Egypt, creation begins with a spoken word. In Greece, Pythagoras taught that numbers and harmonics govern the cosmos. These are not poetic metaphors. They were scientific observations framed in the language of the time. Modern physics now echoes these ideas, describing reality as oscillating fields and vibrating strings. What we consider cutting-edge theory may be a rediscovery rather than an invention. Astronomy provides another window into forgotten science. Ancient observatories were not simple stargazing platforms. They were complex instruments designed to track long-term celestial cycles that spanned thousands of years. Structures like Stonehenge, the pyramids, and Mesoamerican temples align not just with solstices, but with precessional movements of Earth itself. Precession is a slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes roughly 26,000 years to complete. Detecting it requires observations maintained across many generations. Yet ancient civilizations encoded this cycle into their architecture and myths, suggesting institutional knowledge that far exceeded human lifespans. This raises an unsettling implication. Either ancient societies preserved scientific data with extraordinary accuracy over millennia, or they inherited this knowledge from a much earlier source. Geological and archaeological evidence increasingly points to the existence of advanced cultures before the last ice age, civilizations that were erased by global catastrophes and remembered only through fragments. Flood myths appear on every continent, describing a time when the world was destroyed and knowledge was saved by a few. These stories may not be allegorical. They may be historical records filtered through time. Medicine in the ancient world also defies expectations. Egyptian surgeons performed brain surgery. Indian physicians documented plastic surgery techniques that would not reappear in Europe for over 1,000 years. Ancient Chinese medicine mapped energy pathways in the body that modern science now associates with nerve and fascia networks. These systems were not random. They were consistent, repeatable, and effective enough to persist for centuries. What is striking is not just the presence of medical knowledge, but the philosophy behind it. Illness was treated as imbalance, not malfunction. Healing addressed the body, mind, and environment as a single system. Modern medicine is now slowly returning to this holistic view, recognizing the role of stress, emotion, and lifestyle in disease. Once again, what appears new is actually ancient. Even metallurgy hints at lost techniques. Some ancient metals display molecular structures that suggest controlled cooling processes and alloy compositions that should not have been achievable with known methods. The famous Damascus steel, capable of holding an edge sharper than modern blades, remains partially unexplained. Roman concrete, infused with volcanic ash, grows stronger over time and resists seawater better than modern equivalents. These were not accidents. They were technologies developed through deep material understanding. One of the most controversial aspects of ancient science lies in energy. Many ancient sites are located on geological fault lines, underground water channels, or areas of high electromagnetic activity, and alignments may have allowed them to interact with natural forces in ways we no longer recognize. This idea becomes more provocative when examining the Great Pyramid. Its internal chambers, shafts, and materials suggest functions beyond burial. Granite, used extensively inside, contains high levels of quartz, a piezoelectric material that generates electrical charge under pressure. The pyramid's geometry amplifies stress and vibration. Some theories propose it was part of an ancient energy system, though mainstream archaeology rejects this outright. Yet no definitive explanation for its design exists. The resistance to these ideas often stems not from evidence, but from paradigm. Modern science operates within strict boundaries. Anything that challenges the accepted timeline of progress is treated with suspicion. But science advances by questioning assumptions, not protecting them. The ancients were not ignorant precursors stumbling toward modernity. They were observers of nature who developed systems suited to their worldview and environment. In some ways, those systems were more integrated and sustainable than our own. As time passed, this knowledge fragmented. Wars, collapses, and ideological shifts destroyed libraries and killed scholars. When centralized empires fell, so did the institutions that preserved complex science. Knowledge that once required entire civilizations to maintain was reduced to symbols, rituals, and myths. Later generations inherited the forms without understanding the functions. What was once science became religion. What was once technology became legend. Yet traces remain. In sacred geometry embedded in cathedrals and temples. In myths describing flying machines and weapons of light. In symbols that appear worldwide, identical in form and meaning. These are not coincidences. They are remnants of a global language of knowledge that predates modern borders and histories. Today, we stand at a crossroads. Modern science is reaching limits where reductionism fails to explain consciousness, gravity, and the nature of reality itself. At the same time, ancient ideas are resurfacing, validated by new tools and theories. The forgotten science of the ancient world is no longer just a curiosity. It may be a missing chapter in humanity's understanding of itself. If knowledge was once lost, it can be rediscovered. But doing so requires humility. It requires accepting that progress is not always linear, and that the past may hold answers to the future. The ruins scattered across the planet are not monuments to ignorance. They are warnings, reminders, and invitations. They ask a simple but unsettling question. What else did we forget? Very well. I will continue the voiceover narration seamlessly. Same tone. No subheadings, no formatting, just deep continuous storytelling. As modern civilization advances, it assumes superiority over everything that came before it. We measure intelligence by technology, progress by speed, and knowledge by how much control we exert over nature. Yet this belief collapses when confronted with the silent evidence left behind by ancient cultures. These civilizations did not dominate nature. They cooperated with it. Their science was not built on conquest, but on observation, alignment, and harmony. And because of that, much of what they achieved appears invisible to us today. Ancient science did not rely on written formulas alone. It was encoded into stone, landscape, ritual, and proportion. Knowledge was stored three-dimensionally. A temple was not just a place of worship. It was a textbook, an instrument, and a machine. To walk through, it was to move through layers of understanding. Measurements were lessons. Angles were equations. Materials were chosen for specific energetic and acoustic properties. When those structures were damaged or repurposed, the science embedded within them became unreadable. This is one of the greatest misunderstandings of the ancient world. We search for libraries when the libraries were cities. We look for machines when the machines were monuments. We expect blueprints when the knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, initiation, and experience. Ancient science was lived, not merely recorded. Time itself was understood differently. Ancient cultures tracked vast cycles that dwarfed individual lifetimes. They recognized that civilizations rise and fall in patterns governed by natural forces beyond politics or kings. This awareness shaped how they preserved knowledge. Instead of assuming permanence, they assumed collapse. That is why critical information was distributed across regions and cultures, encoded in myths and symbols rather than centralized in fragile institutions. This also explains why similar scientific principles appear across the globe under different names. The same geometry, the same astronomical alignments, the same symbolic language emerges in places separated by oceans. This does not require advanced travel in the modern sense. It suggests a shared inheritance from an earlier epoch, one that understood Earth as a connected system. Catastrophe plays a central role in this story. Geological evidence confirms that the end of the last ice age was marked by sudden climate shifts, massive flooding, and widespread destruction. Sea levels rose rapidly, swallowing coastal settlements where early civilizations would most likely have flourished. These were the population centers, the hubs of trade and knowledge. When they vanished, history reset. Survivors carried fragments of what was lost. Over generations, these fragments became sacred traditions. Precision became symbolism. Science became myth. Later civilizations revered what they no longer understood, copying forms without knowing their original purpose. This is why later structures often imitate earlier ones, but lack the same precision or function. The knowledge was already fading. Language itself transformed. Ancient scientific terms became poetic metaphors. Descriptions of energy fields became gods. Natural forces were personified to preserve memory when technical understanding was no longer possible. What modern readers dismiss as superstition may actually be compressed data, preserved in the only form that could survive cultural collapse. Even numbers were sacred because they describe reality. Ratios like pi and phi were not abstract concepts, but natural laws observed in growth patterns, planetary motion, and human anatomy. Architecture based on these ratios resonated with the human body and environment in measurable ways. Modern studies show that certain proportions influence psychological and physiological states. The ancients already knew this. Sound was another pillar of forgotten science. Chanting, bells, horns, and resonant chambers were used deliberately. Certain frequencies affect brain waves, emotional states, and even cellular behavior. Ancient spaces were acoustically engineered. Some chambers amplify whispers across vast distances. Others create standing waves that can induce altered states of consciousness. These were not entertainment halls. They were laboratories of perception. Consciousness itself was considered a field to be explored. Ancient science did not separate mind from matter. Observation was understood to influence reality. Rituals were structured experiments repeated over centuries. Results were cataloged in symbolic form. Initiates were trained to experience phenomena directly, not just theorize about them. Modern science is only beginning to acknowledge the role of the observer. Quantum physics now suggests that reality behaves differently when measured. Once again, ancient insight resurfaces at the frontier of modern thought. The difference is that ancient cultures built entire systems around this principle, while modern science is still struggling to integrate it. The loss of ancient science was not a single event. It was a long erosion accelerated by conquest, dogma, and simplification. Complex knowledge requires stability and patience. Empires prioritized control. When power replaced understanding, the old systems were dismantled or ridiculed. Anything that could not be easily controlled was labeled heretical, primitive, or dangerous. Yet the evidence remains stubborn. It refuses to disappear. Every unexplained artifact, every impossible alignment, every ancient technique we fail to replicate is a reminder that our story of progress is incomplete. The past is not a straight line leading to us. It is a cycle marked by brilliance, collapse, and rebirth. We are not the first advanced civilization. We may not be the last. The forgotten science of the ancient world is not about nostalgia or mystery for its own sake. It is about recognizing patterns. When knowledge disconnects from wisdom, collapse follows. When technology outpaces understanding, fragility increases. Perhaps the greatest lesson the ancients left behind is this. True advancement is not measured by what we build, but by how deeply we understand the forces we interact with. They studied the earth as a living system. They aligned with cycles rather than fighting them. They encoded knowledge to survive catastrophe, not just prosperity. If we listen carefully, their science still speaks. Not in equations written on paper, but in stone that hums, in geometry that calms the mind, in myths that mirror cosmic truth. The question is no longer whether ancient science existed. The question is whether we are ready to recognize it. And if we are not, history has already shown us what happens next. The deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that ancient science was not primitive science. It was a different branch of understanding altogether, one that modern civilization abandoned rather than surpassed. Our ancestors were not obsessed with speed, efficiency, or endless growth. They were concerned with balance, longevity, and alignment with forces far larger than themselves. Their goal was not to dominate the world, but to remain in harmony with it long enough for knowledge to endure. This difference in intention changed everything. Ancient scientists were not specialists isolated into narrow fields. They were observers of patterns that repeated across nature. Astronomy informed agriculture. Geometry shaped medicine. Sound influenced architecture. Every discipline flowed into the next because reality itself was seen as unified. Fragmentation of knowledge was considered dangerous because understanding only one piece of a system without the whole invited imbalance. This worldview explains why ancient innovations often appear impractical to modern eyes. Structures were built to last thousands of years, not decades. Cities were positioned according to celestial rhythms, not economic convenience. Technologies were designed to work with natural forces, not replace them. When those natural conditions changed, the systems failed gracefully rather than catastrophically. Modern engineering often collapses when a single component fails. Ancient systems were resilient because they were redundant and adaptive. Water management systems in ancient India and South America regulated floods and droughts without mechanical pumps. Terraced agriculture prevented erosion while increasing yields. These methods sustained populations for centuries without exhausting the land. Today, similar techniques are being rediscovered under the banner of sustainable design. One of the most misunderstood aspects of ancient science is its relationship with symbolism. Symbols were not decorative or mystical in the modern sense. They were compression tools. Complex ideas were reduced into images that could be remembered, transmitted, and reconstructed even if language changed. A single symbol could encode astronomical data, biological insight, and philosophical principles simultaneously. This allowed knowledge to survive long after its original context was lost. The serpent, the tree, the circle, the spiral, the mountain. These symbols appear everywhere because they describe universal processes: growth, energy flow, cycles, and stability. When ancient texts describe gods performing impossible feats, they're often describing natural forces using symbolic language. To dismiss these accounts as fantasy is to misunderstand the medium, not the message. Writing itself was considered a weak container for advanced knowledge. Text can be copied inaccurately, meaning could drift, but a building aligned to the stars cannot lie. Geometry does not change with translation. This is why the most important ancient knowledge was recorded in stone, orientation, and proportion rather than ink. The Earth itself was the reference frame. This also suggests that ancient civilizations expected to be forgotten. They anticipated periods when literacy would decline and interpretation would fail. Their science was designed to be rediscovered, not continuously maintained. A future civilization, observing carefully, could reverse engineer the principles embedded in their works. That future civilization may be us. However, rediscovery requires the right questions. If we approach ancient remains assuming ignorance, we will only find confirmation of that belief. If we approach them as deliberate constructions built by intelligent observers of nature, new possibilities emerge. Precision becomes intentional. Alignment becomes data. Myth becomes memory. There is growing evidence that ancient people understood Earth as an electrical and energetic body. Lightning, magnetism, and atmospheric electricity were observed and respected. Certain ancient sites show signs of vitrification, stone fused as if exposed to intense heat or energy. Traditional explanations struggle to account for this. But if ancient science included controlled use of natural energy phenomena, these traces begin to make sense. Even gravity may not have been fully mysterious to them. While they lack mathematical formalism as we define it, they may have understood gravity experientially as a force that could be influenced indirectly through resonance, mass distribution, and geometry. This would explain myths of levitation not as magical events, but as misunderstood technological processes that no longer exist. The loss of this science was accelerated by cultural shifts that separated humanity from nature. As populations grew and hierarchies hardened, power replaced wisdom as the primary organizing force. Knowledge that empowered individuals was seen as a threat to authority. Simpler belief systems were easier to control. Over time, the old sciences were suppressed, altered, or erased. What survived did so imperfectly. Fragments scattered across religions, philosophies, and folk traditions. When examined individually, they seem contradictory. When viewed together, patterns emerge. The same principles surface again and again, wearing different masks. Modern science now finds itself circling these same ideas from a different direction. Systems theory, complexity science, quantum physics, and neuroscience all point toward interconnectedness. Reductionism is giving way to holism. Observation is no longer neutral. Consciousness is no longer easily dismissed. The ancients would find these developments familiar. This convergence is not coincidence. It suggests that humanity is slowly rebuilding a worldview that once existed, though with different tools and language. The danger lies in repeating the same mistakes. Ancient science collapsed when it became disconnected from ethical restraint and collective responsibility. Power without understanding leads to destruction, regardless of era. The forgotten science of the ancient world is therefore not just a historical curiosity. It is a mirror. It reflects both what humanity is capable of achieving and how easily it can lose everything. Knowledge is fragile. Civilization is fragile. Nature is patient. The ruins around us are not failures. They are messages left across time. They say that intelligence does not guarantee survival, that technology alone is not progress, that forgetting who we are in relation to the world carries consequences measured not in years, but in ages. If we listen closely, the ancient world is not silent. It speaks through stone, through proportion, through patterns written into the earth itself, and it waits to see whether this time we will remember long enough to learn. As the narrative continues to unfold, one truth becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The ancient world was not driven by superstition, but by disciplined observation refined over immense spans of time. Their sciences were slow sciences. They unfolded across generations, not grant cycles. A discovery was not rushed to publication. It was tested through repetition, seasonal change, and long-term consequence. Only what endured was preserved. This patience allowed ancient observers to recognize patterns invisible to short-term measurement. They noticed how human behavior shifted with lunar cycles, how crops responded not only to rainfall, but to stellar positions, how seismic activity correlated with underground water movement. These observations formed predictive systems that worked not because they were mathematically elegant, but because they were grounded in reality. Calendars were among the most sophisticated tools of ancient science. They were not merely for marking time. They were models of the universe. Many ancient calendars tracked multiple overlapping cycles simultaneously: solar, lunar, planetary, agricultural, and ritual. When aligned correctly, these systems could predict eclipses, seasonal disruptions, and even social instability. Time was not linear to the ancients. It was rhythmic. This rhythmic understanding of reality extended into human physiology. Ancient healers observed that the body operated in cycles, from sleep and digestion to emotion and cognition. They treated illness by restoring rhythm rather than attacking symptoms. This approach seems primitive until modern chronobiology confirms that nearly every biological function follows a clock governed by light, magnetism, and internal oscillators. The ancients did not have microscopes, yet they mapped the invisible. They did not have telescopes, yet they understood cosmic cycles. They did not have computers, yet they processed data through architecture, ritual repetition, and collective memory. Their laboratories were the world itself. One of the greatest casualties of forgotten science is the loss of context. Remove a tool from its system, and it appears useless. Remove a practice from its worldview, and it becomes superstition. Modern researchers often isolate artifacts without reconstructing the environment they were designed to operate within. This leads to confusion and dismissal. For example, certain ancient objects resemble batteries, lenses, or mechanical devices. Individually, they are anomalies. Within a lost technological ecosystem, they may have been components of larger systems. Imagine discovering a spark plug without knowing what an engine is. Context matters. This is why ancient science cannot be rediscovered through artifacts alone. It requires relearning a way of seeing. A worldview where nature is intelligent, where observation is participatory, and where knowledge carries responsibility. Without this mindset, even if we replicated ancient techniques, we would misuse them. The ethical dimension of ancient science is often overlooked. Knowledge was restricted, not because it was mystical, but because it was powerful. Initiation ensured that understanding matured alongside character. Modern society distributes powerful technology with little regard for psychological or social readiness. The results are evident everywhere. Ancient myths often warn of misuse. Stories of gods punishing hubris are not moral tales. They are historical warnings encoded in narrative. When knowledge outpaced wisdom, catastrophe followed. These stories were not meant to frighten. They were meant to prevent repetition. As civilization cycles forward, the same threshold appears again. Humanity is unlocking forces it barely understands. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and planetary-scale technology echo the ancient fear of imbalance. The forgotten science of the ancient world reminds us that knowledge divorced from harmony leads to collapse, regardless of era. Perhaps the most humbling realization is that forgetting may be part of the cycle. Knowledge accumulates until it destabilizes the system that supports it. Collapse clears the slate. Survivors rebuild with fragments. Over time, the fragments form a new whole. Progress is not linear. It is recursive. The ancient world understood this. That is why their science was designed to survive forgetting. It waited patiently in stone and symbol, knowing it would be misunderstood until the time was right. Rediscovery was always the plan. Now, as modern science confronts its own limitations, those ancient patterns are becoming visible again. Not because we're more advanced, but because we are asking better questions. The forgotten science is no longer hidden. It is simply waiting to be taken seriously. And when it is, humanity may finally realize that the future it is racing toward has already been lived once before. The realization that ancient science anticipated rediscovery reshapes how we view history itself. History is not merely a record of progress, but a memory with gaps wide enough for entire scientific traditions to fall through. What survived was not necessarily what was most accurate, but what was most resilient. Fragile truths disappeared. Durable patterns remained. Ancient cultures placed enormous value on observation without interference. They watched rivers before redirecting them. They studied soil before planting. They followed the sky for centuries before building calendars. This restraint allowed them to understand thresholds, points beyond which systems collapse. Modern civilization, driven by speed and extraction, often ignores these thresholds until they are crossed. This difference becomes evident in how ancient science approached power. Power was something to be balanced, not maximized. Fire was sacred because it could create and destroy. Water was revered because it sustained and erased. Earth was honored because it stabilized and buried. Air was respected because it carried breath and storms. These were not elements in a poetic sense, but variables in a planetary system. Ancient scientists recognized feedback loops. They knew that altering one part of a system affected the whole. This is why many technologies were intentionally limited, not because the ancients lacked imagination, but because they understood consequence. Some doors, once opened, could not be closed again. When modern researchers ask why ancient civilizations did not industrialize, they assume that industrialization is the natural goal of intelligence. Ancient science suggests otherwise. The goal was continuity, not expansion. A civilization that lasts 10,000 years is more successful than one that burns brightly for 300 and collapses. The remnants of ancient science challenge modern definitions of intelligence. Intelligence was not measured by invention alone, but by restraint, foresight, and integration. Wisdom was practical. It was tested against time, not ambition. This perspective also explains why ancient knowledge was often circular rather than linear. Progress was measured in refinement, not accumulation. The same principles were revisited at deeper levels of understanding. Initiates did not move forward so much as inward. Mastery meant seeing the same patterns everywhere. In such a system, forgetting was not failure. It was reset. When complexity exceeded capacity, collapse restored balance. The science that survived collapse was the science most aligned with natural law. Modern humanity stands at a familiar point in this cycle. Technological power is accelerating faster than ethical adaptation. Systems are growing more complex while becoming more fragile. The ancient world has already lived this experiment. Its ruins are the data. The forgotten science of the ancient world does not demand belief. It demands attention. Attention to patterns. Attention to limits. Attention to the possibility that our ancestors were not waiting for us to surpass them, but hoping we would remember them. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: if ancient science could be forgotten once, it could be forgotten again. The question is not whether humanity can rediscover lost knowledge. The question is whether it can retain it long enough to change the outcome. As the thread continues, another layer of forgotten science begins to surface, one that modern thinking finds especially uncomfortable. Ancient civilizations did not see intelligence as belonging exclusively to humans. They observed intelligence in ecosystems, in weather patterns, in the movement of stars, and even in stone. Nature was not passive matter awaiting manipulation. It was an active participant in every process. This perception led to a science of listening rather than forcing. Ancient builders studied how landscapes responded before placing structures. Mountains, rivers, and fault lines were treated as living constraints, not obstacles. When something was built, it was built into the logic of the land. This is why many ancient sites feel inseparable from their environment, as if they emerged from it rather than being imposed upon it. Modern experiments show that certain locations amplify sound, electromagnetic activity, and even human perception. The ancients identified these places without instruments, using long-term observation and embodied experience. Sacred sites were not chosen for symbolism alone. They were functional nodes within a larger planetary network. This network perspective explains why ancient sites often align across vast distances, forming geometric patterns that span continents. These alignments are difficult to explain through chance. They suggest a global understanding of Earth as a coherent system, long before the idea of a spherical planet was formally accepted. Ancient navigation supports this view. Long before magnetic compasses, travelers crossed oceans with precision. They read stars, currents, winds, and subtle environmental cues that modern instruments struggle to replicate fully. This was not instinct. It was trained perception refined into science. The body itself was used as an instrument. Sensitivity was cultivated deliberately. Fasting, rhythm, breath control, and sensory isolation were not religious practices alone. They were methods for tuning perception. A sharpened observer could detect changes in environment that others ignored. Knowledge was experiential before it was conceptual. This emphasis on experience is why ancient science resists modern reconstruction. We attempt to understand it intellectually, while it was designed to be understood physically and mentally. Without the practices that train perception, the knowledge appears incomplete. Ancient education reflected this. Learning was gradual and immersive. Students were not given answers. They were taught how to observe. Only after years of preparation were deeper principles revealed. This prevented misuse and ensured continuity of understanding. The collapse of these systems broke the chain of transmission. Without the training, symbols lost meaning. Techniques became rituals. Science became religion. And religion, stripped of understanding, became dogma. Yet, even in its degraded form, traces of the original science persist. Meditation affects brain structure. Chanting alters nervous system activity. Geometric environments influence mood and cognition. These effects are measurable today, confirming that ancient practices were rooted in real phenomena. The forgotten science of the ancient world was not anti-technology. It was selective technology. It favored tools that enhanced awareness over tools that replaced it. This distinction may be its most important lesson. As humanity accelerates toward automation and abstraction, it risks losing direct relationship with reality. Ancient science warns that when perception weakens, wisdom collapses. No amount of data can replace awareness. The past is not urging us to abandon modern science. It is urging us to complete it, to reintegrate what was stripped away, to remember that intelligence is not only about control, but about comprehension. And somewhere within the silence of ancient stone and forgotten symbols lies a quiet challenge. If we truly believe ourselves advanced, We should be capable of learning from those who came before us. As the story deepens, the forgotten science begins to reveal its final, most profound dimension, the understanding of collapse itself. Ancient civilizations did not view collapse as an anomaly. They expected it. Their science accounted for it. This alone sets them apart from modern civilization, which largely operates under the assumption of indefinite continuation. Ancient records, when read carefully, suggest that cycles of destruction were not only observed but measured. Floods, droughts, fires, and celestial disturbances were tracked across centuries. These were not random disasters. They were phases in long planetary rhythms. When thresholds were crossed, systems reset. This awareness shaped everything. Cities were built to be abandoned. Knowledge was distributed rather than centralized. Oral traditions ensured redundancy. Even sacred stories were designed to survive memory loss. The ancients prepared for forgetting because they knew forgetting was inevitable. Modern society treats collapse as failure. Ancient science treated it as transformation. What mattered was not preventing collapse at all costs, but ensuring that something meaningful survived it. This is why ancient monuments are overbuilt, why myths are repetitive, and why symbols are universal. Redundancy was intentional. There is evidence that some ancient knowledge was deliberately sealed away, intended for future rediscovery. Chambers hidden within structures. Codes embedded in proportions. Myths that only make sense once certain concepts are known. This was not secrecy born of elitism, but of timing. Knowledge released too early or too late could be destructive. This introduces a radical idea. Ancient science may still be incomplete by design. Certain aspects may only become visible when humanity reaches a similar level of understanding. Until then, the information remains dormant, protected by misinterpretation. Modern archaeology often treats ancient people as static, frozen in time. Ancient science suggests they were dynamic, adaptive, and aware of their own impermanence. They did not believe they were the pinnacle of civilization. They believed they were one phase in a much longer story. This humility may be the greatest difference between ancient and modern worldviews. The ancients looked backward and forward across deep time. Modern civilization looks forward but rarely backward. It assumes novelty equals improvement. Ancient science warns that novelty without memory is repetition. The forgotten science of the ancient world ultimately confronts us with a choice. We can continue viewing the past as primitive and irrelevant, or we can recognize it as a lost chapter in human understanding. One path leads to repeated collapse. The other offers the possibility of continuity. Nothing about this requires rejecting modern science. It requires expanding it, integrating long-term observation, ethical restraint, and systems thinking. Learning to ask not only whether something can be done, but whether it should. The ancients left no instruction manuals. They left patterns, patterns that persist across cultures, climates, and catastrophes. Patterns that describe how intelligence emerges, how it missteps, and how it can endure. We're living inside one of those patterns now. And whether the science of our age becomes forgotten like theirs depends on whether we choose to listen before silence returns. The final realization settles in quietly, not as a revelation, but as a recognition. The forgotten science of the ancient world was never truly lost. It was set aside, buried beneath layers of misunderstanding, arrogance, and haste. What vanished was not the knowledge itself, but the patience required to see it. Ancient science did not promise control. It promised relationship. It did not offer certainty. It offered orientation. Its purpose was not to eliminate mystery, but to live intelligently within it. This is why it feels alien to a modern world obsessed with answers. Ancient science was comfortable with questions that lasted lifetimes. This difference explains why so much of it survives only indirectly. Direct instructions would have been useless without the mindset that produced them. Instead, the ancients left behind conditions for rediscovery. If future humans reach the same questions, the same pressures, the same limits, the knowledge would reappear naturally. That moment may be now. Modern science is confronting paradoxes it cannot resolve through measurement alone. Consciousness refuses to be localized. Reality behaves differently when observed. Systems collapse faster than they can be optimized. The Earth responds to human activity as a unified organism rather than a passive resource. These are not new problems. They are ancient ones returning under modern names. The ancients anticipated this return. They understood that intelligence cycles, that forgetting is followed by remembering, and that remembering is followed by responsibility. Knowledge that survives catastrophe is not the loudest or the most complex. It is the most aligned with reality. What we call myths were safety vessels. What we call temples were instruments. What we call rituals were experiments. What we call gods were forces described in human language. When these are stripped of literalism and examined as functional systems, the ancient world becomes disturbingly familiar. The forgotten science does not ask to be worshipped. It asks to be resumed, not copied blindly, not romanticized, not forced into modern frameworks, but understood on its own terms. It asks us to slow down, to observe longer, to think in centuries rather than quarters. It asks us to see ourselves not as masters of Earth, but as participants within it. If we succeed, the science of our age may become something different from what history has seen before. Not another peak followed by ruin, but a bridge between cycles. A civilization that remembers enough to endure. If we fail, the pattern will repeat. The structures will crumble. The data will scatter. And future minds will stand among our ruins, wondering how a civilization so powerful could have known so little. The ancient world left us this warning not in words, but in stone and silence. The forgotten science was never meant to save us. It was meant to remind us. And what we choose to do with that reminder will decide whether this story ends here or continues far beyond us. The silence after that reminder is not emptiness. It is space. Space for choice, space for recognition, space for responsibility. Ancient science understood that moments like this are rare. Civilizations do not often become aware of their own position within the cycle. When they do, the opportunity is brief. The forgotten science of the ancient world was built on attentiveness. Attentiveness to subtle change, to slow signals, to warnings that arrive quietly before catastrophe becomes obvious. Modern civilization excels at reacting loudly and late. Ancient civilization trained itself to respond early and gently. This difference may determine everything. When ancient observers saw imbalance, they adjusted behavior rather than systems. They reduced activity, redistributed resources, altered rituals, and shifted priorities. They understood that complexity amplifies consequences. Small corrections made early prevent violent corrections later. Modern systems resist small corrections. They demand growth, speed, and efficiency even when warning signs multiply. Ancient science would recognize this as a dangerous phase, one where intelligence outruns wisdom. And yet, ancient science also believed that awareness itself can shift outcomes. Observation changes behavior. Recognition alters trajectory. The moment a civilization sees the pattern loosens its grip. That may be the real purpose behind the survival of this knowledge. Not to resurrect ancient methods wholesale, but to restore a way of thinking that modern tools desperately need. A way of thinking that sees technology as an extension of responsibility, not an escape from it. A way of thinking that measures success by resilience, not dominance. The ancients did not leave us answers because answers expire. They left questions that remain relevant no matter the era. How much is enough? What must be preserved? What happens when limits are ignored? What survives when everything else fails? These questions are not philosophical luxuries. They are engineering problems, ecological problems, psychological problems, and civilizational problems. Ancient science treated them as such. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is believing that ancient science belongs to the past. It does not. It belongs to any civilization mature enough to look at itself honestly. It belongs to any society willing to accept that intelligence without restraint is not progress. The ruins are not accusations. They are invitations. They invite us to remember that we are not the first to reach this point. They invite us to learn without repeating collapse. They invite us to finish a conversation that began thousands of years ago and was never meant to end. Because the forgotten science of the ancient world is not about what was lost. It is about what can still be carried forward. The continuation does not arrive as revelation, but as responsibility. Responsibility is the final test ancient science always placed upon knowledge. If understanding did not mature into care, it was considered incomplete. Power without responsibility was not intelligence. It was imbalance waiting to collapse. Ancient civilizations understood that the most dangerous moment is not ignorance, but partial understanding. Knowing enough to act, but not enough to foresee consequence. This is why ancient science advanced slowly. Every discovery was absorbed into culture before being expanded further. Knowledge had to settle into ethics, behavior, and long-term awareness before it could safely grow. Modern civilization does the opposite. It externalizes consequence. Damage is delayed, displaced, or ignored until it becomes unavoidable. Ancient science recognized this pattern as terminal. Systems that cannot feel their own impact cannot correct themselves. The forgotten science, therefore, placed immense value on feedback. The earth provided feedback. The body provided feedback. Society provided feedback. Ignoring feedback was considered madness, not progress. Many ancient collapses described in myth are not punishments, but feedback loops finally overwhelming denial. When ancient texts speak of a fall, they're describing loss of alignment. When they speak of dark ages, they're describing loss of perception. Light and darkness were metaphors for awareness, not morality. This is why ancient science emphasized remembrance. Not memory of events, but memory of relationship. Relationship between humans and land. Between action and consequence. Between knowledge and humility. When those relationships were forgotten, collapse followed naturally, without malice or intent. What modern humans call sustainability is ancient science rediscovered under pressure. What modern humans call systems theory is ancient science translated into mathematics. What modern humans call mindfulness is ancient science stripped of cosmology. The core ideas persist because they describe reality accurately. The tragedy is not that ancient science was forgotten. The tragedy is that it was remembered only when consequences returned. And now they have returned again. Climate instability, ecological collapse, psychological fragmentation, technological acceleration without comprehension. These are not separate crises. Ancient science would identify them as symptoms of the same imbalance. Intelligence disconnected from context. The ancients believed that every civilization faces a choice between expansion and integration. Expansion feels powerful. Integration feels slow. Expansion impresses. Integration endures. One leads to monuments. The other leads to continuity. The monuments remain when integration fails. Stone lasts longer than wisdom when wisdom is not practiced. This is why the ancient world speaks most clearly through ruins. They are what remains when memory breaks. They are not failures. They are evidence. Evidence that intelligence alone is insufficient. Evidence that forgetting is costly. Evidence that knowledge without restraint destroys its own foundation. The forgotten science of the ancient world does not promise salvation. It offers orientation. It tells us where we are in the pattern. What we do with that orientation is no longer science. It is choice. And choice, unlike knowledge, cannot be preserved in stone. It must be made again every time a civilization reaches this point. Every time it believes itself new. Every time it forgets how old the lesson truly is. The forgotten science of the ancient world teaches that intelligence alone does not guarantee survival. True understanding comes from observing patterns, respecting limits, integrating knowledge with ethics, and remaining aware of the consequences of every action. Ancient civilizations mastered systems, thinking, holistic observation, and long-term planning, principles that modern society is only beginning to rediscover. Their ruins and symbols are not just relics. They are warnings, guides, and invitations to remember that knowledge divorced from responsibility leads to collapse. The lesson is clear: awareness, restraint, and integration are as important as discovery and innovation. If you found this journey through the mysteries of ancient science fascinating, don't forget to subscribe for more videos uncovering the secrets of lost civilizations and forgotten knowledge. Stay curious and keep exploring the past to understand the future.